Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today, we'll be speaking with Erin Jones. Erin is an amazing powerhouse of influence and goodness across Washington State and certainly beyond. She is an author, educational leader, and somebody who I consider a mentor and a friend. Please welcome Erin Jones. Well, Erin, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you making time to share your knowledge, your skill sets, and all the amazing work you do.
I'm honored to be here.
Could you please tell us a little bit about you and your connection to public education?
I was actually adopted by two educators as a baby. I was adopted in St. Paul, Minnesota. I was adopted by these two trained educators. My dad was a middle school math teacher, and my mom was an early learning teacher, and they both taught in the public school in Minnesota, and then decided they wanted to see the world. I think for a lot of reasons. My parents are white. I think it was hard to be our family in Stillwater, Minnesota. And so they decided to take jobs. My dad took a teaching job at the American School of The Hague in the Netherlands. And we moved there when I was 5 years old in 1976. And I did my schooling there. So I went to private school, a really elite private school, my entire childhood. And my mother ended up teaching there as well. So I had both my parents as teachers. I never had a desire to teach. I wanted the opposite thing. I did not want to be like my parents. I was very clear with everyone. No, I don't want to teach. I don't want to be like them. I thought they worked way too hard for too little money and too little recognition. And so when I decided to come back to the United States for college, my dream was to be a lawyer. I was going to go to college, then go to grad school. I wanted to go to Harvard Law School and then go back to the UN and work at the United Nations World Court in The Hague, because that's where everyone worked. All the parents of the kids that I went to school with, their parents worked at the UN World Court. So in my mind, that's how I was going to make the biggest impact on the world. And then when I got back to the US and got to visit a couple schools in North Philadelphia, I was mortified by what I saw. I thought, coming from Europe, I thought America was in a much different place than it was. Economically, racially, socially. We saw all these movies and TV shows that made America seem like the most magnificent place and everybody has everything they need. And that's really how I came to expect America. And I'd seen The Cosby Show and Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. We just had the first few seasons we'd watched multiple seasons of The Cosby Show, but the first season of The Fresh Prince had just come out. And so in my mind, people who looked like me got to experience life that way. And then I got to Philadelphia, the home of Will Smith, and discovered that was not an accurate depiction of how most Black people were living in America. And as I visited these schools, I knew really clearly I have to be a part of this. And I knew somehow, even at 18 years old, like I was made in this body that's both Black and white. I was raised by white educators. I was raised in a school that believed I could do anything I put my mind to as a way to prepare me to be that for children who look like me in the country that I was born in. And so I remember calling my parents in April of 1990 at 18 years old, just before my 19th birthday, and telling them I'm not coming back to Europe. I know that I want to invest the rest of my life in making sure that children who look like me get a great education. And so that was the beginning of a journey. I began volunteering in schools in 1990. And then literally changed my whole class schedule and worked around my basketball schedules. I played basketball in college just to teach in a classroom 2 days a week in North Philadelphia, my junior and senior year. 100% Black school, 100% poverty. We did not have a computer in the entire building in 1992 and 1993. There was not a computer. There was a mimeograph machine. They did not have a library. And it became very clear to me that this was the biggest social justice civil rights issue in the United States to me. It was very clear to me that these families were set up for failure. How can you expect children? How dare we accuse Black and brown and poor people of being dumb and not wanting an education and not give them access to education? How dare we? And so I just remember knowing then I want to really invest in these young people. And then my husband and I got married in South Bend, Indiana. And South Bend is a very divided community. So it's segregated, Black and white. It's a very binary community. There are more Latina folks there now, but at the time we were there in the 90s, it was all Black and white. And the Black folks lived on this side of town and the white folks lived on this side of town. And what was interesting is they were doing busing still. So they had started busing in the late 80s and they were still doing busing in the early 90s. And so you were busing kids from the heart of the Black, and I hate the word ghetto, but it was a ghetto. We didn't have stores in our community. There was no public transportation there. And so you're taking these kids from that community and busing them out to the suburbs with the white children who have everything. And every single day at school, we would have not riots, but we'd have fights. And it was obvious, the kids could see the difference. And the kids knew this was wrong. The whole setup, not just school, but the whole setup, the kids knew this was wrong. And it was at that point I knew it was bigger than school. And so when we finally moved to Washington State, I did everything I could in every building I was in to be part of leadership teams and to be on every committee I could be on, because I knew that what happened in my classroom really mattered, but it was bigger than my classroom. I served on the school improvement team for 3 years at Baker Middle School, or not at Stewart Middle School in Tacoma. And that would connect me to the then state superintendent, Dr. Bergeson, Terry Bergeson. And 2 years later, when I won Teacher of the Year, she would ask me to come back and work for her at the state superintendent's office. And I served as a director, and then she didn't get reelected, and Randy Dorn was elected. And instead of being fired, which I absolutely expected because I'd been hired by the previous superintendent, he actually promoted me to cabinet. So I sat on cabinet under Randy Dorn for 3 years. And that was incredibly eye-opening, just to see, again, the tentacles that impact what happens to young people in classrooms. And that was some of the greatest learning of my life, was being able to be on Capitol Hill and watch how decisions got made, by whom they were made, almost always by white men who had zero connection to the Black community, zero connection to poor communities, zero connections often to the east side of the state. And I had taught in both Western Washington and Eastern Washington. So I knew that the needs of students in Yakima and Spokane were very different from Tacoma or Seattle. But I got to see how decisions got made, often by people that were in urban cores on the west side of our state, and often by people whose children were 30 years out of public school, whose children probably even went to private schools or went to some of the best funded public schools in our state. And I knew then, like, something else has got to give. And so I left OSPI after 4 years, knowing that I needed to take all that knowledge back to the school district and help administrators and classroom teachers and families better understand how the system worked and how to push against the system, how to advocate for children in the system. And that has been my connection. I went on to run for state superintendent in 2016 and lost by 1 point, which I'm really glad about, because I'm happy I missed the pandemic. I'm really happy that I didn't have to run our state schools during the pandemic. So I feel like I was rescued by 1 point. All of that learning from running for office also taught me new things about who makes decisions in this state, and really got me connected to school boards. I did not understand, even from the state soup's office and from school district, I didn't understand the intimate connection school boards have to what's happening around the state and what's happening in school districts. And I will say that my running for office opened the door to that. And now I get to do a lot of work. I've been hosting the school directors conference for the last 3 years now. And part of that is because I understand the power they wield and want to make sure that my ear is constantly to the ground. So I try to be in a school building at least once a week still as a consultant. I am working with school directors usually 2 or 3 times a month, and then try to be around superintendents and principals as often as I can. So I'm trying to keep my fingers in every part of the system in any way possible.
Actually, quite a career when I think of all of your experience. I mean, you have a history with AVID,
Yeah.
right? And you're multilingual. There's these components that you're still connected to young people. I know you hold calls on Mondays and Fridays, and you still essentially have a class, right, online, right? So you're still in the direct kind of teaching role, as well as your administrative experience from district to state. So with all of that and your life's work that you still continue to do, my big question I've been asking is, what is the purpose of public education?
It's a question that I've been sharing, as you know, because you attend some of our Monday classes. We've wrestled with that over the last 3 years. What is public education? And I think it's a question we've not been asking enough players in the system. I think when I first got into school in the 70s, public education as it exists today has not changed very much. In the last 50 years, it hasn't changed very much. And as anyone who's been in education for a while knows, public education was really designed after the Industrial Revolution as a way to prepare people to go into factory jobs. And so it was meant to teach students basic skills, learn how to punch a clock, the bells from one to the next. I mean, this very, everything is very much regimented. And it was about, teaching people how to move through the system. And we're not in that place anymore. And what we know to be true now, and I don't need to do research on this, I just need to look at my own 3 children who are all young adults. Our young adults are going to have 2, 3, 10, 15 jobs in their lifetime. Unlike us who, I obviously am kind of unique in that I've had lots of positions and I've moved across the country. But for most people in their 50s and 60s and definitely 70s, they had 1 or 2 jobs their entire lives. And that was the expectation. Just get into a job and stay in the job forever. And so what we were preparing people for was, have these basic skills and then learn how to just stay with something. Right now, I think when I think about what students need, I look at my children. The most important thing is they need to be critical thinkers. They need to understand how they learn. I think we don't do enough work at helping young people understand themselves. I think we go the opposite direction and we kind of insist that every person show up in a classroom and do everything in a consistent way. When, I have 3 kids and they could not be more different than they're like the 3 points of a triangle. They're that different. And the only thing that is the same about my 3 kids is that they all sing. Other than that, their learning styles are completely different. What they like is completely different. And school often didn't work for them because it wasn't designed for any of the 3 of them. And so when I think about what education should be, and I understand that this is complicated, but I absolutely think it's possible, is I think our children should learn who they are first, is most important. Who are you? What are the identities you carry? What are your learning styles? What are the things you're passionate about? I've stopped asking kids what they want to do when they grow up, and I ask them now, who do you want to be? Who's the person you want to be? Because what you do is going to change. Who you are, you can create that person, and then you can build skills onto that person to do different tasks. But I really want to challenge young people to think about, how do you move? Like, what makes you have joy in your heart? Like, what's an activity that just gives you incredible joy? What are things that make you feel like, I can really do this? This is really in my skill set. What are the things that are really challenging for you? What are ways that we can help you hone those things that you really love? If you really love to draw, we should be finding opportunities for you to draw to give your answers. Now, you should also learn how to write. But I think too often we ask everybody to do everything exactly the same way. And it doesn't allow students to really develop their unique talents and skills. So I think critical thinking, really important, personal development, who am I, but also creativity and curiosity. And those 2 things for me are kind of, they're similar, sometimes the same, but I think we've taken creativity and curiosity out of school spaces. And I think creativity and curiosity are what makes students want to engage in school spaces. And it's why so many students, I think right now, are disengaging. There's no place to be curious. We don't give them opportunities to be curious. There's this body of work that you're supposed to know, and we're going to teach it like this. And this is just how you just got to know from A to Z. You just have to know this. And the reality is some students really want to get to M, and other students really want to get to O, and other students have an idea that's outside the alphabet. And maybe that's it right now, because maybe the answer for cancer is outside the alphabet. Right? It's not even on the list of things. And so I think if there's a way to really create space for young people to be curious and to get creative, and I think there are so many ways that people can be creative. It's not just painting and drawing. I think kids can get creative in even coding on a computer. Kids can get creative in so many different ways, but we are so limited and finite in the ways that we think about what a school day should look like. I think it's hindering teachers too, because I think teachers more and more, I see this in the last few years, I thought the pandemic was going to save us from all of this, and it was going to open the door to these really new ways of thinking and new ways of being, and let's use technology in a different way. And I think we're becoming even more constrained. And I am hearing of more and more teachers who are expected to be on the same page as their counterparts 2 doors down in the math book. And that tells me that we're not embracing creativity and curiosity. It tells me we're not embracing the diversity of learning styles. And to me, that tells me we're not doing education. We're doing something else, indoctrination. And what's ironic about that is I hear Republicans talking about indoctrination, and their idea of indoctrination is you're slamming kids with all these leftist ideas. That's not how I see indoctrination. I see indoctrination as we're expecting kids to all do everything the same way in their math textbooks and their history textbooks and their English textbooks, and a good essay looks like this, and it has this style, and it must start with this, and it must end with this. And that to me is indoctrination. And that's more dangerous than anything else, is kind of putting kids into a box and giving them 12 years of time in that box. And then when they get
that's a long time.
That's a really long time, right? And then they get outside of that box and they have to live and be in a world that is not that box. And we haven't taught them how to adapt and adjust and get curious and get creative, and they don't know themselves really unless they've had parents who really give them the opportunity to flourish at home. We're setting them up for failure. So how do we think about who they want to be and then help them get there?
I've been thinking a lot about what are our children, especially current students now today, what are they inheriting? And it's just major crises, right? From a climate crisis, immigration crisis. I mean, there are multiple serious problems they're going to have to solve in 20, 30, 40 years. And so this idea of critical thinking, but not only individually, but with others, like, team problem solving, learning how to learn and who we are. La Cima is now 20 years old. And that's really, I've called it identity development, kind of like this personal development term that you use, but asking who you are, like the richness that comes out of that exploration, the empowerment that comes out of that exploration, for me as an educator is, that's beautiful to witness.
Yeah.
You see self-worth kind of develop before your eyes. There's nothing more magical than that. Essentially, like my big, what do we really teach is I can. That's what I want to teach. I can.
Yeah. Yes. And that doesn't help students thrive in a world that is constantly changing and shifting, and they have to learn how to adapt, and they can't adapt if we have taught them all this time to comply. They can't. The other thing that you just made me think of too, I did a TikTok video about this yesterday or the day before, I can't even remember, but I think we've failed students, particularly in higher ed, in learning to talk about hard things. And I bring this up because of Claudine Gay and what has happened with Harvard University. And, in the wake of the protests that were happening there, and then her speech in front of Congress, which I didn't agree with at all. I didn't agree with any of the president's take on how students should be allowed. I don't think we should ever allow students to yell out loud that genocide is okay. And if there were students on campuses saying, all Jews should be killed, I don't think that's appropriate on any college campus, personally. And so I didn't agree with the president's responses. And yet the way that communities responded to her, it's caused a lot of people in higher ed to talk about, on so many of our college campuses right now, if they are conservative leaning, then no liberal ideas are allowed. And students are discouraged from even talking to those people. Conversely, on liberal-leaning campuses, no conservative ideas are allowed, and no conservative speakers. And if we do have conservative speakers, students will protest and yell and scream at them. And so we've created a dynamic on higher ed campuses where kids are living together. They're living together for 4 years, where we're not giving them spaces to wrestle with these hard things, which is politics. And as a nation, we need to be able to wrestle with those things. Now, I say that, but I also believe we've got to be creating those spaces in secondary schools too. I think we have to be creating spaces where, and I do a lot of assemblies around this, where this idea of belonging is not that you have to agree with everybody around you or have the same philosophy or religious practices, but you do need to see your peers as human and equally valuable as you. And it means we've got to create spaces where students can be fully themselves and learn how to be in community with people who are really different from them. And I don't know how we do that in school spaces at a national level, but I really think we're missing the boat on that. And our entire nation is bearing the weight of that. And I fear for our future if we don't get that right. And I think it starts in K-12. But I also would invite our higher ed folks to think really carefully. I think we've missed an incredible opportunity with students when they step away from home to pay a lot of money to be at a college campus. to not have opportunities to engage in really hard conversations with people who are not like them.
I think that is public ed. I think it is K-12, even for the younger ones, but certainly around middle school, maybe in late elementary, that to talk about and address hard things. Well, one, I mean, what did our young people receive over this last, there's a lot of vitriol. There's a lot of hate speech, just very clearly, right? Dehumanizing language among the political sphere and elites and that kind of thing, right? So I think all of that gives permission, if you will, like, well, if they get to, so there's that reality that we're dealing with, but also the charge, the somatic, like, constriction in our bodies when we get to hard conversations. We don't really teach to that either, or through that, how to process and work through when you're emotionally charged. And if you're from a people that has been historically marginalized or dehumanized, right, you're already coming into a space in a conversation, whether it's race or gender or sexuality or religion, right? All of these really kind of the hot topics. I'm curious, what have you seen really work? I mean, are theories, philosophies, approaches that you've seen really help young people think critically, discover more about who they are, and be curious and creative?
So, it's been fun this year, especially. I've been doing events at schools that are 3 days long. So I don't just do an assembly. I do an assembly and then I stay for a couple days, and we get to be in small groups and talk. And it is amazing what young people, I was at an elementary school in Atlanta. So these are little people. I was with 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. So I spoke to the whole school for a day, but then I got just 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders for another day. And it was amazing what they were willing to talk about and share about. And I think schools that are willing to engage in these conversations, even in small, I didn't get to talk to every single kid, but this administrative team knew our kids really need to talk about this. We got to bring somebody in. And I don't think you have to bring someone in from the outside always, but I'm just sharing what I have seen. The buildings where they're willing to bring somebody in, whether it's me or someone else, to really invest, not just for an event, because I think one assembly doesn't change anyone. It doesn't, one hour training doesn't change an adult. 1 hour of an assembly doesn't change a kid. It may give them a spark, and those kids that want to do extra learning, it may be the spark that gets them to do extra learning. But in the end, schools that are really willing to invest time in this. I have a friend up in Tukwila School District who is a middle school administrator, and they spent all of last week just talking about what does Dr. King's dream really mean? So it means kindness, not niceness. It means courage. And what does it mean to be courageous? And they decided to take an entire week, and they took off all their traditional academic work and just invested with young people in what people need to know about this particular school. It is the most diverse school possibly in the nation. And what is even more unique about this school is you have groups of students from rival tribes in Somalia, rival tribes in Eritrea. So you have kids in this particular school who may have come directly from the battleground to the United States as refugees, but from different tribes that didn't get along with each other. So here's a school that's living this out. I mean, they are having to navigate things that oftentimes people don't even think about. And instead of doing math and science and reading, guess what? They're learning math and science and reading through talking about these really hard things. And so I think when schools are able to realize that there's incredible academic value in having these conversations, and that academic value is not just in what's tested by the state or by the feds. There's academic value in helping kids understand each other and learn how to talk to each other. When schools realize that, when administrators in a community realize that, I see really beautiful things happening. When administrators don't see that and are so kind of bent on getting their test scores to a particular place, that is, to me, a sign. It's a warning sign. When I talk with superintendents, and I got to speak at the National Superintendents Conference last year, and then this summer I got to speak to new superintendents for the nation. And what I told them is, I want to really encourage you to not get so caught up in what your test scores are that you miss the learning opportunities. And what that will require for superintendents and principals, you have got to be explicit with your staff that we're not evaluating you based on your test scores. Because if you don't say that, the message is very clearly that what we care about in America is our test scores. and you better get the kids to the right test score, to standard or above. And I think when I see principals who are willing to step away from that and say, no, we're going to get to learning, we're going to do what's best for our children, that's where I see incredible stuff happening. And it's counterintuitive. But what I'm also hearing from people is those schools also are getting higher test scores. And it confirms what I've known for a long time. And it goes back to something you said. When kids know I can, when they feel a sense of efficacy for themselves and agency, they do. And they do in every way. And helping them prepare for a test does not help them believe they can, because they don't see themselves in that.
Or the teachers. I think about the stress, the intent,
Yes.
and being evaluated. This is, and it's not really what, I don't know, when I think about teachers who really know their students, right, and really help them grow in many, many ways, right, just as a human being. Just Tuesday, I was in the state juvenile prison where I served, and we were having a great conversation. One of the students says, I don't know how to communicate. He's 20 years old. He's like, my family, when I call these, they say I talk ghetto. I want to be able to talk in different ways. And I love being a chameleon. I love that I can go to many spaces, put on a suit and a tie and talk bureaucracy, you go to the basketball court and talk a different way, right? All the different ways in which we communicate, but he wanted this pathway. You're also noting, I think, I really want to figure out how to get to teach into pluralism. Just the concept that we are, as you mentioned, this school in Tukwila, probably one of the most diverse spaces in all of the globe, right? All coming here in this particular, south of Seattle. Like, I just see the geography and the demographics. Like, what an opportunity to really think about all the ways that people live and all the ways we can live together, and what that means. So how do you manage some of the challenges? What do you see is really the challenges? You mentioned testing in this way, or like adhering to some kind of hard outcome like that doesn't really show my learning. I even questioned grades as a kid. I'm like, does this letter A, B, or C, whatever, like, does this represent my learning? Especially when I got to college. It was like, I got an A in that class. I didn't do anything. Or I got a C in this class, and wow, I was really pushed. I was challenged. I grew. So I'm curious, what are the challenges that you see in making shifts or innovation in learning and really honoring our humanity and like the stuff that makes us grow and do, and how to respond to that?
So first of all, having been adopted by teachers, I've been around teaching my entire life. I don't know what it is to not be talking about teaching and be around teachers. My dad, just as an example, my dad wrote a brand new test for every single math chapter he ever taught in his 37 years of teaching. So every single chapter, he handwrote a test for it. And he wrote a new test, which meant he was coming up with his own answers. And that, for those who don't understand complicated math, like, my dad was doing serious work. And so I grew up around like watching my parents super invested in their classrooms, and both of them are really innovative. So my mom was a home ec teacher, and she got to build her own kitchen and build her own programs. And so I got to witness that as a young person, and then as a young adults. But one of the things I find to be true for far too many in teaching is, and I don't know how I became different from this, but far too many educators teach exactly like they were taught. And they teach in ways that worked for them. And then we train teachers to teach in a particular way, which just confirms for those who, and there are a sliver of educators who were not the best student in their class, and they get into teaching because they want to be that teacher that they didn't get to have. But I would argue that when I visit schools, 80% of teachers are kids who did really well in school and always knew they wanted to be teachers. And so they end up teaching in the same way that they were taught and getting upset when children aren't as interested as they were. So that's kind of challenge number one. And I think we could disrupt that in teacher education if we gave teachers different tools when they were in teacher education programs, and we gave them opportunity to practice different ways of learning, practice failing, practice struggling. But I don't think we do that in teacher education. And I think what teacher education does is it just reinforces the ways that people have been teaching for the last 50 years. Teacher education also hasn't changed. I remember when I went through my teacher ed program, I would call my parents and tell them what we were learning. And they're like, oh my gosh, we used that same textbook 40 years ago. I think one of the challenges is how we even prepare educators to enter a classroom. If we want our classrooms to look really different and be really different, I think we have to have a multi-pronged approach. So I think there needs to be pressure around against testing. I think testing right now, we've over tested. I think we need to stop it. Stop it. All of the things like SAT, ACT, all of it. We got to stop with the testing. So we need to come from that approach around legislation. I think around teacher education, we need to think about innovation. And then how are we creating opportunities for educators to practice what they're learning in classrooms before the last year of their programs? I think we need to get educators into classrooms their first year that they're in programs, and they need to be wrestling with some of this stuff for the entirety of their 4 years in college. And I would also offer, but this is a caveat, I don't think you should get a master's degree after your 4 years of a BA, because you are not a master at anything that you have not done. And we have way too many programs that are encouraging students to go straight from a BA into a master's in teaching program. And y'all are not masters at a darn thing. Haven't even set foot into a classroom yet. So we got to stop that. But we have to really do teacher education in a really different way. And then from government and administration, so that means from state superintendent's office down, administration, we need to stop pushing against test scores. Like, we need to think differently about what does it mean for students to be successful. We need to have those conversations at the admin level. What is learning? What is the point of this thing that we're doing, this endeavor that we're in? And I don't think we're inviting leaders to have these conversations. And I think more leaders need to be involved. I think we need to cross-pollinate. So when I think about like the classes that I facilitate on Monday and Friday, I think what I love about them is we have 18-year-olds to 80-year-olds. And so we've got the continuum of people who are still in school, who are in K-12, people who are in higher ed, people who are educators, people who are retired. We have all of those people in that space. And so we are wrestling with these ideas together. And so Karen brings a perspective as someone who's retired that is really different from Jake, who's 18 years old and is right in the thick of things right now. And I don't think we have enough spaces like that to really wrestle with what should school look like. And I think the only way we're going to change is if we give people in lots of spaces time to really wrestle with this, because it's not going to shift. It's not going to shift quickly. Education doesn't shift quickly. But when we don't have all the voices at the table, what happens is we end up with this top down. You know, I think about when I was at OSPN in 2012, when Common Core became a thing, and suddenly in a year we had to pivot. And suddenly Common Core was the thing. And now we got to make a new test for it. And you have these top-down things that happen. And in states, there was not conversation until they'd already decided what the Common Core were. So you come around the backside and now try to get people involved in conversation. We need to start on the front side with folks and allow decisions to come from the bottom and the top instead of just top down. We gotta so it means engaging students in these conversations. It means engaging teachers, it means engaging administrators. And I don't see anyone willing to have those conversations right now or host those conversations.
You know, I've been asking this question, that if you went to schools that taught you everything you needed to know to live a healthy, I think that's critical, meaningful and successful life, what would you learn and how would you learn it?
Wow. So I will say that my school in The Hague was not perfect, but it's pretty close. And part of it was every teacher knew me, from the elementary teachers to the high school teachers. It was a small enough building that we could all know each other. So everybody knew what my talents were. People knew right away that I loved athletics. They knew I loved music. And because it was a small enough environment, when there were opportunities, they knew they could come to me and say, hey, Erin, I got this opportunity. And they knew each of us. No, like, here's the thing. And so I think sometimes, you know, I was in this elementary school last week of 1,100 children, elementary school, 1,100 children.
It's a big system.
It's too big, right? And so how do you provide support for that many children? I think a school where you are known by your name, you're known by your story, you're known by your talents, you're known by your struggles, where you learn to develop your talents and develop your skills. And I will say I did that at ASH, at the American School of The Hague. I was able to do that. I had a French teacher who just absolutely believed in me. And she knew I was kind of a weird kid. I've always been a weirdo, but I had lunch with her every day. And she was working on her PhD while I was in high school. And she was the first woman I knew I'm 52. There were not a lot of women like going on to get beyond a master's degree. Even master's degrees were kind of a big deal as a woman. But here was this woman who was so classy. Like, I loved the way she dressed. And and she was getting her PhD. And she would sit with me at lunchtime and talk about what she was learning in her PhD. And that was just so inspiring to see this other woman who also spoke French, who saw me as her equal. Obviously, I was not her equal, but she saw me with enough respect that she was willing to share with me about the work she was doing in her PhD program. And so how do we as adults in spaces really see our children not as these things that need to be shaped? They already come to us with all this brilliance and beauty inside them. And it's our job to help them see it, to just be the mirror, to remind them when they don't see it. And she was that for me. My mother has always been that for me. My father has always been that. And I had both my parents as teachers twice. So I got to see, and my dad was one of the hardest teachers I've ever had in my life, and possibly my best teacher ever. Like my dad, I am not naturally a great math student. So math was really super hard for me. And I had him for honors math twice. And man, he pushed me so hard. But he pushed me because he knew I could do it. If I just, Erin, stop it. Stop it. No, don't say can't. I don't want to hear can't. Go do 10 more problems. And he always showed me multiple ways. So he never, in our classroom, he never gave us just one way. He would say, okay, here are 2 or 3 or 4 different ways you can do this problem. You decide what way works for you. Okay, it doesn't work for you this way. Let me give you another option. And what I loved about that he modeled for me is not everybody learns the same way. And so I think in school spaces, and I had so many teachers like him that just gave me multiple ways to learn a thing, that I think was so beautiful. I think also I was encouraged to help other people. And I think in school spaces, when you realize that your identity is bound up in the identities of those around you, your success is bound up in the success of those around you, I think that's a critical lesson to learn. And I think about for our school, we hosted the largest Model United Nations in the world. So every year our school shut down for the first week of January. And we would host kids from literally all across the world at the actual United Nations. We would host our own United Nations. So we always, because we were the host school, we always got one of the big countries. So whether it was the US or Israel or the Palestinian Liberation Organization was one of them that we got my freshman year. And the PLO ambassador actually came and trained us. His diplomats came and trained us. Israel was ours the second year that I was in high school. They came and trained us, their delegation. And so I think also not being afraid to talk about real stuff with kids. I think school should be a place where we talk about real issues, like not these theoretical things that could happen, but what's the stuff, the real stuff right now. Let's practice dealing with and talking about and wrestling with what's actually happening in the world right now, so that whatever comes up for you in your adulthood, you will have already wrestled with some very real things and learned how to do that. And I will say that my school did such an amazing job with that. And obviously it was a private school. And so there were ways that they were able to, but as someone said in a podcast the other day, if you look at any of the DoD schools, the Department of Defense schools, those schools are all amazing and they're all integrated. So if you go to any DoD school, it has Black and white and Native and it has everybody in it, and they perform really well by intention. And those schools are funded by our government. So I think there are things we can learn from other places, and America does not like to learn from other places. We think we know everything, and we think nobody else has anything to teach us. I think we could learn a lot from Indigenous people right here in the United States and how they do what they do and how they pass learning on through oral traditions and through dance and song. I think there are so many things we could learn from people who are already here. And I think in school spaces where we allow for that, that's what we need to prepare for life and thriving beyond school.
So I'm hearing a few things. One, like a base culture of dignity where students and everybody involved, right, is their worth is seen, heard, recognized. And out of that, then there's an image that came into my mind. I think often some of the concept of mental model of teaching is that we open up minds and pour in knowledge and like off you go. But it's not just, it's actually a cycle, right? We're also extracting, right, that curiosity and that creativity where we're not putting in, we're inviting out and into the public space or shared learning space. So but not just about the individual but that's happening collectively in small groups, large groups, the whole school community. And then this piece here around, sorry, there's so many thoughts flowing right now. This piece here around practice, right? So I did a YMCA youth and government program my senior year in high school. I was the only one in my high school to do it. I wrote a bill on a graduation requirement for multicultural education at the time. It was ethnic studies before I knew what ethnic studies was. But I got to come to Olympia. I sat in the chairs. I was this, senator, and we did all the mock, right? So the practice. And I know there are other programs I've been part, like mock court, but actually practice the thing, and whatever it is, actually running the chainsaw, actually, doing the thing that that we get to explore. I just saw in Spokane schools, they're inviting students to weld in middle school. Right? And so if you actually do the things, you're not just sitting down, taking in, information and then spitting out what you think they want to hear or see, right? It's versus the experience of doing something.
Well, and I think too, just when I think about teaching middle school, which is where I spent most of my time and where I currently spend most of my time in middle schools, so many middle schoolers just need to be up and moving and doing something, period, right? They do not need to be just sitting down for 6 hours of the day. And I think we're killing them. And I know for me, I was really good. I was a compliant kid. And I could sit for 6 hours. I could do it. But I know me as an adult now, I hate to sit for 6. I can do it. If I have to, I can do it. But I am miserable. And so I think, too, we need to rethink how we are physically designing spaces for school and then what we're spending that time doing. I think there should be much more interaction. There should be much more singing and dancing and playing games and running. And we should have much more time outside playing, especially for our younger children. Even through middle school, they need to have much more time just being able to play and run. And the reality is we know that the poorer the kids are, the less grass they have in their community. So the less safe places they have to play. And, in Atlanta, where I was, when I met with these 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, every single one of them, when I asked, what would you want to change about school? Every single one said, we need more time to play. Every single one. And it just struck me that these kids, the one place they have grass, after listening to their stories, they all live in apartments. The one place they have grass is at school. And if they're lucky, they get 15 minutes on the playground. And I just think that's a setup for disaster. And even though we don't get to control where children live, if we know where they live, then we do get to control how we give them space while they're with us. And that 6 hours, I think, would be much better spent letting them play for a third of it even, because there's so much learning that happens in play. And I think that's something that the Dutch do really well. The Dutch in the early years do much more focus on play than on the academic stuff. And what we know from test scores is the Dutch outperform almost every other country in test scores by the time they get to high school. But I think the foundation of play is really critical. And so if there's something we can learn from another country, I just will say I've seen evidence of it, that just the ability to play and seeing play as a viable pursuit is something that I think we're missing at every level.
So that's clear. I saw something the other day come through a statistic that somehow we learn, 20 times faster something in play, the same thing that would take us, 200 times of repetition in kind of this compliance model. So I'm curious, any calls to action for our listeners as we think about wrapping up this conversation?
Yeah, I think if you're a classroom teacher, here's my call to action for you. I think so often when I was a classroom teacher, I didn't think my voice mattered outside of my classroom. So I saw, I just got these kids, whether it was 20 kids or 150 kids, whatever year I was teaching, it depended. These are my kids and this is my job right here. But the thing that I would encourage classroom teachers to do, we need your voices at school board meetings. We need your voices in Olympia. I love the union and they play a role, but the union does not represent your voice as a classroom teacher. Your union represents your voice in terms of how much you get paid and how much time you have in the job. But we need your voices in the legislature to talk about what is happening in your actual classroom space, in your schools. And so we just know that your voices matter. And so maybe you can't leave your school to go testify, but you can write a letter to your legislator. You can write a letter and have it entered on days where the House Ed or the Senate Ed committees are meeting. Most teachers don't know this, that you can actually sign in for a meeting and just have a letter represent your voice there. And I know I didn't know that as a classroom teacher. So I want to encourage you, if you're a classroom teacher, figure out how to do that, please. We need your voices. Administrators out there, I need you to give your staff permission to just be with their students and to not be so focused on some end result, some hard end result. I really want to encourage you. And as you begin next school year, well, this is something that I shared with teachers when I talked with them the first week of January. If we were 2 weeks ago, I would have said to you, give teachers at least a week to just get to know their students again, as if you're starting the year all over again. And I would encourage you, as you begin next year, to think about giving your teachers permission to spend those first 2 or even 3 weeks just getting to know students with no pressure around hard academics. Because here's what I also know from my classroom experience, but also being out in schools right now. Once students know each other and know themselves and know their teachers and trust their teachers, there's a way they will excel academically in the other stuff. It doesn't work backwards, though. We shove academics down kids' throats that first and second week of school, and they have not built trust and they haven't built community yet. It's an uphill battle, and it doesn't have to be. And so, administrators, I would encourage you to give, and you need to give your staff permission. You need to explicitly give them permission, or they will just take on the messages that they're getting everywhere else, that test scores. So you have to be explicit about something else. Superintendents, same to you. And what I would say to superintendents is get in classrooms, please. Get out into buildings, and not with a camera. So don't bring your communications person and use it as a photo op into buildings. And actually see what classroom teachers are doing. Just watch and see what your students are learning and how they're moving through the world. That is so critical. Your office is not where the work happens. The work happens where the people are, and the people are out in your classrooms and your buildings. And then for all of you who are educators, so that means paras, front office, anyone who's in a building, pour into yourself, please. You cannot pour out of an empty vessel. And so it is really important to think about, what are you putting in yourself? What are you reading? What are you listening to? How are you physically feeding yourself? Are you hydrating? What are you doing to take care of your physical body? What are you doing to take care of your spirit? Who are your friends? You got to have a couple friends at least. Even those of you that are loners, and you got to have at least a couple of people that are in your corner that when you're having a bad day, you know, you can call them and they can be the mirror for you to remind you. Yeah, you got to fill yourself up. Then for those of you who are watching who are not involved in education directly, maybe you're a parent or you're just a community member, get involved in some way. If you happen to live near a school, which almost all of us do, offer to be little kids, right? Go and show up at a school and volunteer to just be an adult in a building during lunch. It is amazing. I will go into buildings, and you have to do all of the paperwork to be a volunteer in a building. But I tell you what, sitting at lunch with a group of elementary school kids, for so many of them, they don't have parents that have time to really invest in them. So having adults from community who are willing to just come in and sit and listen to little kids or read to little kids is a powerful thing. Schools need additional hands and hearts. Maybe somebody that just has half an hour a week and you can make copies, or you can take coffee to teachers. I don't know what it is, but our schools need your hands and your hearts in them. If you're someone that doesn't want to be in a school, call the school and say, hey, I have $100 and I'd like to buy some supplies for your school. Can I buy, what is something that you need at your school building? There are so many ways that you can invest in schools. And whether you have children there or not, those children are part of this community. And how they turn out will affect you, positive or negative. And so we all are responsible for what happens in those schools and what comes out of those schools. And so don't say, well, I don't have kids, so it's not my problem. It is. It's all of our, I don't want to say problem because they're not a problem, but we are all responsible for all the children. It's not the school's responsibility on its own. And so if you're someone disconnected, find a way to connect.
I appreciate that you broke it down into all kinds of roles. I really, really appreciate your time. It is an honor, blessing, privilege to be here with you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for what you're doing, and blessings to you and your family too.